they gave us a router and like the.
Okay, so lesson 5 is on properties of parallelograms. And so what you're going to notice is you completed your investigation. And so what we need to do is we need to go over some of the conjectures that you had. And so the first one, opposite angles of a parallelogram. What did you find out about those after completing your investigation? Opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent, correct. So then you also then looked at consecutive angles. What can you tell me about consecutive angles? They are supplementary, okay? Opposite sides of parallelogram are? Opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent. They're also parallel, but they're a little more specific. They are actually congruent. So let's refresh again. Opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. Okay? Consecutive angles of a parallelogram are supplementary. And last but not least, opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent. And so now we need to figure out what about the diagonals of a parallelogram. The diagonals of a parallelogram, not congruent.
Yeah, they're,
What do they do?
I don't know.
Bisect.
Ah, they bisect each other. Good job.
Oh.
Okay, so the diagonals of a parallelogram bisect each other. And so those are the conjectures that you discovered. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to look real quick at something else that deals with parallelograms, and then you'll be left to go on your assignment. Part of the questions on your assignment deal with vectors. A vector is a quantity that has both magnitude and direction. That's what a vector is.
So direction and magnitude.
Okay. Did you learn that in science or something?
No, that's off of Despicable Me.
Oh, so a quantity that has both magnitude and direction is known as a vector. And so a vector describes quantities such as velocity, acceleration, and force. So you will see this a lot, like if you would take physics. They'll talk about the force vectors, they'll talk about the acceleration vectors and the velocity vectors. Those of you, when we get to calculus, we will do some work with acceleration and velocity problems as well. And so we represent vectors by an arrow. And so if you notice, there's a picture of a plane. And they talk about the engine velocity at 560 miles per hour. And then you also have a wind velocity of 80 miles per hour in the direction that they give you here. And so what ends up happening is when you have that wind affect your plane, it's actually going to push the course of the plane. The plane will not be going this straight direction as it appears here. What's that wind going to do? It's going to move it this way a little bit, to the right. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about then what happens here. And so what ends up happening is you have your initial direction of the plane, which is right here. And then what you do is you have this wind direction right here. And so the question is, what's going to be the net result of the plane? Well, what's going to be the net result of the plane is you're going to actually make a parallelogram. And when I make my parallelogram, the net direction of the plane is going to be the diagonal in that parallelogram. You can kind of see how that works. We've actually got a parallelogram. If I were to outline it here, here's my parallelogram. And the net direction of the plane is going to be the diagonal. And so we call that the resultant vector. It's often called a vector sum. And basically we made a parallelogram with the vectors as the sides, and then the resultant vector is the diagonal of the parallelogram. From the two vectors as tails to the opposite vertex. And so the reason why that's going to come in handy is because on your homework today you're going to have a few questions that deal with vectors. And let's go ahead and look at your assignment. Your assignment is found on pages 283 through 284. The problems, are 1 through 13. So let's go ahead and look at 1 through 13, not number 7 or 8. Okay, so 1 through 13, not number 7 or number 8. And let's go ahead and look at 9 and 10 real quick because those deal with the vectors. And so on 9, it says in exercises 9 and 10, copy the diagram, or the vector diagram, and draw the resultant vector. So what you're gonna do on 9 and 10 is you're going to draw in a parallelogram. You're gonna make a parallelogram with those two vectors, and then just draw the diagonal. That will be the resultant vector. Okay.
Wait, how do we draw it then? Do we just copy the angle?
Yep, copy the angle. So you can just actually trace that. Okay. I will actually cut off number 12 as well. So not 7 or 8 or number 12. Okay. So this is due tomorrow at the start of class. Tomorrow we're going to talk more about parallelograms.